Hi, I'm Aoifinn Devitt, a host of the 50 Faces podcast. And I thought it would be a great idea for 2024 to reflect on the wonderful guests, the content, the diverse ideas, the extraordinary debate that we hosted over the course of the year. But I wanted somebody else to find the interesting points to focus on in that. And no better than a fellow podcast host and previous guest on this podcast twice. We focused on the Love series, and we also had a main podcast focusing on John. And John Harney of Aon. Welcome, John. Thank you for being the volunteer to ask us about our year.
Thank you, Aoifinn. And yes, Happy New Year. It's brilliant to be here. It's brilliant to be back, and I'm looking forward to an interesting conversation. I suppose turning the tables on you, Aoifinn.
Absolutely. Well, now I'm going to be change seats and let you ask me about the year we've had, and hopefully we'll touch on some of the themes that I think are worth amplifying after a fantastic year of almost 60 podcasts.
And it's incredible, isn't it? 60 podcasts. It's amazing. My simple maths tells me that that's more than one a week. So that is impressive, I think, by anyone's standards. But I suppose taking a step back from it all, I suppose if you want to just tell me and the listeners just about the year generally, 2024, that was discuss.
Yes, well, certainly this, looking at the macro backdrop, this was a year of choice and the election year across the world. It was a year
Yeah.
of incumbencies being challenged and ideas being thrashed about. And I think it was also a year of massive geopolitical challenge, as well as the emergence, and I'd say the defining of sides and really sharpening of edges in a culture war. And this was a culture war that I think is on many fronts, and it certainly definitely contaminates or flows into the world of investment, especially the world of investment that we focus on. One of our founding values in the 50 Faces podcast was diversity and inclusion, DEI.
Hmm.
That has been an area that has been very much under the microscope and challenged by institutional investors, politicians alike.
Yep.
Similarly, we focus a lot on sustainable investment. That's been another area caught in the crosshairs of this culture war. So, especially with some of who prevailed in the election, the general sense of being tired of incumbents, out with the old, in with the new. And we saw that really come into focus with the re-election of President Trump in the US in November.
Hmm.
This, I think, is starting to really define the sides of the culture war. And 2025 is going to be fascinating as to how that affects the world of investing.
And I'm thinking how, as that all emerged, I suppose live in real time over 2024, as you were recording over 60 podcast episodes, what themes were you discussing with your guests? And I suppose if you can shout out a couple of specific ones, it might be nice to have our listeners listen back to those where they're pertinent.
Absolutely. Well, we always try to focus on the human side of finance. So that has been our founding principle, and nothing has changed. And we curate the guests based on who is going to have an interesting backstory, perhaps, who has an
Hmm.
extraordinary mixed career, and equally who is going to offer us an unvarnished deep dive into
Yeah.
different sectors. So just starting with what has not changed. And I think that's a really important thing because I spoke earlier about the volatility in the world, and not only the volatility in politics, but also in the economy. We've had, the soft landing. We've had interest rates start to fall after having risen. A lot of U-turns going on and a lot of uncertainty still in markets. But what is constant, and what I find is constant for many of my guests, is a focus on the fundamentals, not losing sight of who really,
Yes.
really matters in the end. And I'm going to start with one of your areas, pensions, because Penny Green, it had recently retired after a role as trustee of Sol Trustee Company, and she previously was chief executive officer of Sol. And
Mm.
that's when I got to know her, and that's an investment committee that I sit on. And when we look at her episode, we have
Hmm.
basically I tracked her role and her career in pensions. And what it all comes down to, why was she so effective? Because she never lost sight of putting the members first. This
Yes.
was her touchstone, her grounding point. It defined her, it defined how she approached her role. And that allowed her to never lose sight of who we were all doing this for. And
Yeah.
as she became passionate about pensions, like many, she fell into it by
Yes.
accident. It was a serendipitous twist that led her to find this role in pensions. And she just focused on the keeping the members first. And she was extremely I think, honest about her self-reflection around the type of leader
Mm,
she was. She spoke her mind. She could be very assertive at times, and she was great at leading change and establishing a culture. What she saw was that the point of time of the company where it was time to move beyond that establishment of the culture into more of a collaborative type of management style, she
hmm.
recognized she may not be the appropriate leader for that. And that
Yeah.
was that time that she stepped back into her last phase of her career, which was as a trustee of Sol, stepped out of the chief executive role. So I
Yeah.
thought that self-awareness was remarkable. And just
Yes.
continuing that theme, in the last bonus series, we had a conversation with Carol Jeremiah from MFS, again, somebody who fell into investment management after a career in fashion, of all things. It was interesting to hear how fashion and her awareness of fads, failures, zeitgeist affected her ability to address clients in the investment product market with the same way,
Hmm.
thing on fads, failures, zeitgeist. And again, just like Penny, Carol's focus was never lose sight of the client's best interest.
Yes.
And that was what guided her for 40 years through MFS. She's now president of the company, and she still has been guided by that. So I think really that's a reminder that knowing your values, focusing on them, and knowing that they can persist for 40 years, that is the key to really staying true and to having a successful career.
Yeah, and I think the thing that stands out to me as well is that point you made about self-reflection, that actually asking yourself those difficult questions that may have difficult answers, because I'm sure, changing your role and realizing you may not be the person to bring things forward is a challenge, and it's a challenge on an emotional and a cognitive level, but actually having the bravery to do that, self-reflect, and then take the action on that, I think is hugely powerful. And I suppose there's mirrors of that in both careers and in investing, because oftentimes, like you say, you can lose sight of the wood for the trees, so to speak, with culture wars and geopolitical things, when actually fundamentally we're all about getting value for whoever the stakeholders are, be that members in a pension space or just investors outside of it. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. Yeah, we had a great we had a great year full of discussions, and I'd say one of the other themes that came out again, and getting back to the kind of, stepping wood from the trees point, is this focus
Mm.
on return. And we had
Yes.
two conversations, one with both from large sovereign wealth funds or similar structures, one from CPP Investments with Derek
Hmm.
Walker, who I think was probably one of certainly the main purveyors of a total return approach. And
Mm.
with Matt Winneray, from previously CEO at New Zealand Super Fund, who again were key proponents and I think essentially architects of the total
Mm.
return portfolio approach. And this is the ultimate wood for the trees. They become label agnostic. Everything becomes holistic at the portfolio level.
Yeah.
There is a great need for cultural buy-in to that, and that was the theme that came up time and time again. The
Yeah.
importance of culture, that it cannot be eat what you kill, each team for themselves. There has to be a focus on the total overall portfolio and
Yes.
rewards and incentives based on that. So I'd say that was a movement that's gaining considerable traction. And it was interesting
Mm.
that very separately from two regions of the world, we had two, I'd say, one of the original architects of that come up and speak with us. So I think that is the ultimate wood from the trees, both at the top level, as we
Yeah.
mentioned, and then at the bottom level, who is this all for?
And and I think it's fascinating. I suppose we're having a discussion here, and we're agreeing with each other quite a lot. And I suppose what I'm wondering is there anybody or any particular topic or episode that challenged you and actually made you change your mind?
It's very interesting looking at something like the conversation with Frank Dixon at the end, which was around system change. He
Hmm.
focused on, I didn't even know what system change was initially. And I really, you can hear it in the tenor of the conversation. I'm really probing. I'm saying, what does this exactly mean? This is a very top
Yeah.
level concept. We've
Yeah.
been focusing on things like SDGs. We've been bogged down in these overarching aspirational goals. And system change sounds just massive. It sounds too big. The elephant is too big to eat in this question. How do
Yes.
you approach that? And I wanted tangible examples. And I think over the course of that conversation, I really started to learn the tangible examples. But what the reason for him focusing on systems change was that a lot of the focus on sustainable finance thus far, he said, had been not actually delivering anything. And
Okay.
this was, I think, the epiphany that was dawning on me throughout the year was that a lot of the sustainable finance and some of the work around ESG and sustainable investing, that a lot of it, and it's quite rightly, has been called out as being perhaps exaggerated or unproven or not
Okay.
possible to cause an effect in terms of the desired effect. And he basically said that this has not had an effect. So it was only when we step back and we look at, actually creating system change, like changing the incentive system, changing the structure of public-private partnerships, is how we can
Yes.
hope to drive change. So I still perhaps remain to be fully convinced as to how that is that simply too big.
Yeah.
We need things to be small, to be actionable, to be tangible. But that was a good example, I think, of something where I learned a lot throughout the course of the podcast.
Yeah. So your mind is changing on that, I suppose, rather than changed. So I think that we'll take that answer. We'll take that answer. And I suppose on that topic of change, then, and I know we've touched on kind of DEI and cultural stuff. How is the world of asset management changing as you see it now? I suppose now we are in January 2025. So I suppose not particularly looking back, but thinking about the here and now.
Well, I cite the most downloaded podcast we had of the year was episode 261 with David Golub of Golub Capital. And this was
Hmm.
a podcast that went in a surprising direction because this is a big private credit manager, becoming one of the largest diversified managers, and even getting close to the diversified asset managers. It is, I thought we'd focus on credit and the opportunity set. What we ended up
Mm.
focusing on was culture and the importance of
Yeah,
culture and how that is nurtured within a firm and how that is intentional and how we need buy-in. And it's not always warm and fuzzy either, because at the end of the day, there has to be accountability around
yeah,
culture. There has to be a training program and very positive, a positive cycle of feedback. That doesn't have to mean that feedback is positive, but the feedback has to
yes,
be intentional, and that has to be always, as the message that is sent is that this feedback is intended to help you and intended in the
yeah,
spirit of improvement, and that should be the spirit in which it is accepted. So I'd say
yeah,
that is an example of just a focus that is getting more and more attention. I hosted an event on culture in April of 2024. It was just around the emergence and importance of psychological safety within firms, how
yes,
that allows better risk taking, and there was a very vigorous debate on that as to just how important it is becoming, and I suppose how slow perhaps some firms and even some job applicants are to
mm,
realize the importance of that culture. But then equally the need for limitations on that. There's a sense, and this was another great podcast that did I think challenge me, was around the sense that sometimes we have limitations. This is Paul Richards of Better Decisions. We discussed a lot about the reason for having certain guardrails in place around culture, not bringing your entire authentic self to work, perhaps, is that there was good reason for that. That we didn't necessarily want politics in the conference room. We didn't
yeah,
want divisive discussions to take place. We wanted to, back to Penny Green and Carol Jeremiah, focus on the underlying, focus on doing what's best, not necessarily focused on performative politicking in the workplace. So I think that was
yeah.
important because nothing is black or white in our world. And we can't simply say, okay, we're all going to be our authentic selves and we will celebrate that. At the end of the day, this is a business. We're working towards a goal. And I think that nuanced discussion of culture was really interesting.
And this reminds me of a conversation I had with a colleague of mine actually around psychological safety, because it can seem, like you say, a bit maybe fluffy or a bit out there as a concept, but actually she contrasted. Angela Maxwell is her name. She works in our investment team, and she studied psychology as well as finance. So she's a fascinating person to speak with. And she contrasted the global financial crisis in 2008 and what she kind of witnessed firsthand was as a bit gross as it sounds, colleagues vomiting into bins at their desks because of the stress and everything that was happening, versus what she witnessed when there was the guilt related events in Q4 of 2022 in the UK, where actually she saw a much more kind of healthy reaction from her colleagues who were managing similarly stressful events with their clients. But there was nobody vomiting in bins, which is always good. And actually, sometimes that's what psychological safety comes down to at its most basic level, I think, Aoifinn, isn't it? Just, not getting completely overwhelmed by something.
That's a really interesting observation, actually. And I wonder how much COVID contributed to that, the resilience that that built in, um,
Mm,
focus on mental health, um,
yes.
the continued hybrid working. And we discussed all of this as part of the culture discussions, how
Yeah.
much teams being dispersed affects the ability to
Mm,
change culture and nurture culture.
yes.
That is so important. And I'd say another theme that we revisited a few times was around disability in the workplace. In both cases, this was, unfortunately did not get as many guests as I was hoping on the neurodiversity theme. We'll have to park that one for 2025. But we did have
Yes.
two guests who experienced vision loss throughout their lives, one age 7 and one much later in his 20s. And
Hmm.
already in his career and then experienced near total vision loss. And we discussed just how that affected them. And I think the key thing was expectations, how much expectations were crimped and diminished for these individuals because of their disability, which forced them, of course, then to conceal it because they knew that it would affect the view that they were getting, and how they thrived despite it. And what we also hear from that are wonderful vignettes of individuals whose tiny gestures made a massive difference in the career progression of these individuals simply by treating them like human beings and really including them. So I
Yeah.
think that was, getting on the mental health theme. This was actually just such a reminder that,
Mm,
and we could well be entering a similarly time of friction again with
yes.
with market turbulence and tougher times in terms of perhaps AI replacing many of the employees. We will see. I expect some strain, but if we can remember that human side, that is probably going to lead to more engagement and happier workplaces.
Yeah, because that sounds to me even like a story of well-placed kindness versus misplaced kindness, and actually just having that awareness and that correct focus when dealing with anyone that I suppose is different to you in whatever form that might take. But this is a perfect segue, because the next thing I was going to ask you about was about the needle moving on in terms of diversity in the industry? Do you think it is? Could we speed up? Are we there yet? Are we ever going to be there yet? What are your thoughts?
No, unfortunately, I can't say the needle has moved even a shred
Mm,
since I started recording these podcasts, and that's been 4 years. It's been, the way you see this image of the needle kind of hovering and kind of
mm,
wobbling from side to side, but not actually making much progress into either direction. We having actually the point I discussed with two particular portfolio managers who run programs focused on emerging managers, investing in emerging managers. So they
mm,
charged with spotting talent, finding the female or the minority emerging managers and
yes.
leading them and providing that spark capital as well as that nurturing throughout the growth phase. And they would say that this opportunity is very much overlooked. The path for female portfolio managers is still not well carved and is
Okay.
still not easy to see many making it to that level. We seem to have some consensus that the pipeline is getting better, but unfortunately, progression through that pipeline is not getting better. I've spoken
Yes.
with people at the beginning of their career, at the end of their career, and I'd say the opinion that we're still kind of as a grade, as an industry, getting a C minus is, if not a D, is pretty much the consensus I see. I didn't have anyone who didn't want to comment on it this year, interestingly, but so I've had other years where we had no comment because
Yes.
there was perhaps I don't feel placed to comment was kind of the reaction. Everyone was willing to comment. I will say we also didn't have much reflection of some of this anti-DEI sentiment that seems to be taking hold in some quarters. There was still a
Yes.
real engagement around discussing the topic, but a reflection that it was not quite there yet. So that is
Yeah.
disappointing. We keep doing what we can in terms of amplifying these voices.
Yeah.
We see this is one of the most proven ways to improve the landscape for progression is to create more role models and more mirroring of potential career paths. So hopefully that's what we're doing. So we'll keep doing our part.
Yes.
Sadly, seeing the impact is perhaps a little bit out on the horizon.
Yeah, and I think a challenge to all of us, and including everyone listening to this, to listen and take in those stories, but also then to take concrete action to, like you say, improve that pipeline and make sure that people are progressing through that, and it's not just, as you say, in 4 years' time, hopefully we won't be in the same position. We'll have moved the needle. And it sounds like, we through this conversation, you've mentioned a couple of the cross currents in the industry. Is there any more you'd like to add, or I suppose a quick summary of what you see the cross currents to be would be great.
Yeah, I mean, certainly looking at the asset management industry as a whole, and we've focused on boutique managers. We've spoken with pension representatives out of the
Mm,
LGPS, which is, as you know, in the UK now on the cusp of great change and great potential merging and realignment of roles in terms of administering authorities and pool. There's a lot of focus
mhm.
on the Canadian model when it comes to pension funds. We did interview Derek Walker, as I mentioned, from CPP Investment Board, somebody at the Canadian model, one that's working quite well.
Yeah.
Leave it with the question as to whether that would translate well into the UK. That's a big change. I spoke about some of the firms. We had two representatives from Apollo on the podcast. We had somebody from Blackstone, Kurt Summers. He's on the public side of Blackstone, so not as much involved in so that massive change of the private asset side there. But we had a lot of that. These are the large diversified multi-asset managers that are starting to dominate from an asset front and in terms of reshaping finance. We did a lot of discussions of private credit representatives. I mentioned David Golub. We had
Mhm.
somebody from Beach Point Capital, and many others in the mix there. We had some sponsorship from Eagle Point. These are private credit is at the size it's at now is starting to very much emerge from the shadows. That is a factor that is changing again the shape of finance and possibly changing the role of banks and just finance as we know it. So I say that's a reality. But just back to the point, and this is tying together the point of merging of pension funds. And as we see institutional investors get larger, that means the check size they write will get larger, which does
Yes.
actually make the environment more challenging for emerging managers and smaller boutique managers. So that we know that fundraising is a challenge. Have spoken with a lot of groups who focus on fundraising, and we know that's challenging. The one place that seems to be very much open for business and off to the races is the Middle East. And we did quite a few episodes focusing on the Middle East, and we did
Interesting.
more on
Yeah.
that coming in 25. But I'd say that the that changing shape of that, just that consolidation, the survival of the fittest, that becoming too big to fail in some of these groups, and the
Yeah.
challenges that that faces for smaller, emerging, innovative groups is definitely a sea change that we're seeing in asset
Mm.
management. And in the UK, where many of these guests are based, we see that US asset managers, of course, are starting to really make inroads, and that then would be perhaps to the detriment of some of the homegrown players as well. So I'd say lots of
Yes.
change on the horizon. We all know about active management and how much that's been challenged, and certainly the stock market performance with the concentration has made that even more challenging. So I'd say a real need to focus on the edge, proprietary skills, risk taking, how to nurture that. That has been truer than ever. And of course,
Hmm.
alternatives. There is a lot of focus on alternatives. Many of our discussions focused on the democratization of alternatives, pushing that
Yes.
into channels such as the pensions channel and the DC pensions channel, the private
Yeah.
wealth channel. All of this is perceived as a massive growth area. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that in 25.
It it all sounds very exciting for 2025. You've really teed up the year, and I suppose finally, before we wrap up, my question would be, what are you most excited about for 2025? And I suppose both for the industry and for the 50 Faces podcast. You don't have to give away any spoilers, Aoifinn, don't worry.
Well, I'd say we've certainly been hearing, I listen to all the outlooks and I listen to a lot of podcasts, and they
Mm,
say that this election year, 2024, was the year of the podcast in terms of it having a real sort of sense that people are looking to get their media from different independent sources, deeper dive, more human centric, longer conversations, perhaps not as long as 3 hours, but certainly the Joe Rogan style. But that has come into its own. So if podcasting has gained such traction as a medium, that's only good news for us. I do know that what is also very effective, we see this on LinkedIn, is video. And we
yes.
have not only do we have short video vignettes of many of our podcasts, but we also have a separate channel completely which is 50 Faces TV. We've recorded 19 videos to date, and these are short 5 or 10 minute conversations where we focus on a nugget and dig into that. And it's amazing how much we can cover in 5 or 10 minutes. And it's intended to be just a quick video that we can put on a loop and roll through different videos, topics, and be educational, and give a sense of the deeper aspect of that topic, and not just a kind of a soundbite. So more than a soundbite, less than an hour long conversation. I think that format's really exciting. And I think just being prepared to discuss the elephants in the room, really discuss topics in a robust and courageous way. I think that that is going to be an empowering thing we can do in 25. With these culture wars I mentioned, it is important not to feel that we have to take a side. I think it is important that we can
Yeah.
honestly look at both sides and try to step down a little bit beneath the Twitter length or the X length rhetoric and sound bites. Let's dig deeper, find the nuance. And when we find the nuance, I think we will find common ground.
That's a lovely note, I think, to end a reflection on 2024. And I suppose just on a personal note as well, Aoifinn, just to say thank you for everything that you have done with the podcast. And I know you have a fantastic team as well. So thank you to them, because I know the listeners will agree in my gratitude for everything that you have done for the industry, and for hearing those voices that might not necessarily otherwise be heard. So thank you so much, and thank you to the listeners for tuning into this episode. I've had an absolute blast recording it. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as well. And don't you worry, normal service will resume. You'll have Aoifinn back in the hosting seat for the next episode of the 50 Faces podcast.
Thank you, John.